Okay, here we are. Ezra, if you could please concur that we are indeed on Facebook Live, I'd appreciate it. And good morning, everyone. We are studying Moreh Nevukhim, the Rambam's Guide for the Perplexed. This is webyeshiva.org, and this is I am Daniel Korobkin, speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario, at the Bayit Beth Avraham Yosef of Toronto. And we have been studying this text now for a couple of years. We are in the first section, chapter 59 of the Rambam's magnum opus, and the title that we've given to our shir today is the different levels of knowing God amidst the Rambam's negative theology. And just that's a mouthful. Let me just explain what I mean by that. And then we'll bring up our screen to give us an outline of today's lesson. The Rambam had, over the last several chapters, had framed his theology that really God is unknowable. The human mind simply doesn't have the faculties, the resources, or the language to be able to describe God adequately. How then do we find the God of the Jewish people being described in Tanakh with all of these positive attributions when God is devoid of any kind of positive attributes that the human mind is capable of understanding? And the answer is a couple of things that the Rambam is going to review today. Number one, Dibra Torah Kilshon B'nei Adam. The Torah speaks using human language, human metaphor, so that we can have a God that we can relate to on some level. Number two, Tanakh describes God's actions. These are called actional attributes. We realize that when we talk about God as a merciful God, we don't essentially refer to God as being merciful, but the way that we gauge his actions, were these actions to come from a human being, they would be described as coming from a merciful being. And the same thing is true when God is retributive, when he brings retribution upon mankind through a natural disaster or allowing evil to occur in the world. We say that God is an angry God. It doesn't mean that God is essentially angry or that he has any kinds of attributes of human emotion, but rather this is just simply a metaphor in relation to his actional attributes. And we also talked about the negative attributes, meaning that you may find something phrased in a positive way, let's say to say that God is living. And the Rambam's point of that is, it doesn't mean that God is living in the same sense that you and I are living, but that he's not alive. And that's the double negative that the Tanakh wishes to impart to us in our understanding, that God is not alive. God is not dead, and in that sense he's alive. But his aliveness is nothing like the living that you and I experience. Okay, so that's the idea in a nutshell. And now I'm going to share our screen to help us go through the lesson for today. I hope everyone, the screen should be coming up. There it goes. And I hope everyone is able to see the screen. So once again, the Rambam is actually quite wordy in this chapter. It's a longer chapter than normal. And as we get towards the end of the first section of Moreh Nevukhim, as we are, the first section of Moreh Nevukhim is 76 chapters, and the closer we get towards the end of the chapter, the more we realize that the Rambam is polemicizing against a particular audience of philosophers of his time, with whom he wants to vigorously disagree, because they're close to the truth, but they are far enough for him to say that they've got it wrong. And the closer we get towards the end of this section, the more the Rambam is polemicizing against a specific audience. And part of his verboseness in this chapter 59, it seems to emerge that he's actually polemicizing against specific audiences of different philosophical ideas that exist both within the Jewish world and in the general social and philosophical milieu where the Rambam is living. And so it's important to note that. So if we find the Rambam sometimes repeating himself I don't believe it's a gratuitous repetition. I believe it's because he seems to be addressing specific points of argumentation that are known to him, but may be so subtle, and because we don't know the background of his disputants, we may not fully appreciate why he's repeating himself in a number of different ways in this chapter. So therefore, I'm going to do a rundown in an outline form, just like we did last week for chapter 58 of chapter 59 today. And the Rambam begins this chapter with a very simple question. I've just gotten through vigorously arguing with you that God is truly unknowable to the human mind. And this may lead you to a simple question. If God is truly unknowable, then what is the point of even trying to understand him at all? And how is the wisest person any different from the least wise persons? Please forgive the typos. How is the wisest person any different from the least wise person? If no one can know God properly, then what's the point of even trying to gain access to him? And how is King Solomon or Moshe Rabbeinu any different from the guy on the street? That's essentially the Rambam's question. And so the Rambam answers this question by stating as follows, number 2. And we have, I think we have 12 points to make as we go through an outline of this chapter. Number 2, in general, the more you can particularize your definition of something, the better you understand it. Which means, just like in the game of 20 questions, the more that I can describe what something is, the more I can narrow down its definition, the better I can picture it in my mind, and the better I can understand what it truly is. And the same holds true even if you can only understand something by way of knowing what it is not, which is the way the Rambam said is the only way that we can know God. And therefore the same holds true with understanding God. The more one knows about what God is not, the more one understands God. And therefore, essentially, the answer to my question is, Moshe Rabbeinu had superior knowledge of any other human being than any other human being about God because he knew more about what God is not than any other human being. And that's a little bit of a sort of a mind twister when you think about it. Moshe Rabbeinu could never fully understand God, but he had a better understanding of what God is not, so he was able to narrow down the experience or the essence of God better than anybody else. And that's why the Torah says, panim bifanim, that God spoke to Moshe face to face. Moshe didn't understand the essential nature of God because Moshe was human just like everyone else was, but he had the best understanding of what God is not. And therefore, the more one understands God, the closer one is to him. And this is a very important point that the Rambam has made allusion to before, but in chapter 59, he expresses this in a way that is, to me, more direct and more explicit than he's done in previous chapters. The more that you have an intellectual understanding of God, the closer you become to God. Dveikut, that thing that the Torah says, uledav kavo, to attach yourself to God, for the Rambam is a mental, intellectual exercise. It is not something that is a feeling, a supernatural kind of idea. It is not through piety that one has dveikut with Hashem, but rather it is with the intellect. And this is an important principle that certainly places the Rambam on one side of a fence, and probably most of the Rambam's colleagues on another side of the fence. But we're not going to delve further into that today because we've talked a little bit about the dichotomy that exists between the Rambam's world of intellectual attachment to God and so many of his contemporaries and those that came after him who subscribed to a more mystical approach to Dveikut. Okay, so now the Rambam gets into some specific examples. He says, I've just told you that it is possible to know God more than another person by knowing better what God is not. So he says, let me give you some examples. And he structures it in a different way than I'm presenting it to you, but I've simplified the way that he structures it. He says the highest form, or the highest way that a person can know God, is to know that God is devoid of any positive attributes, as he's explained in all of the previous chapters. Now, a person may be a little bit lower than in his knowledge of God, and may think that God possesses certain attributes, like God can see and God can hear and God is alive and so forth, but he certainly denies that God is corporeal, that God has any physical form. So that person does not know God as well as the first person. Then we have the third level, a person who's not sure whether God is corporeal or not. He's agnostic about that particular point, and perhaps he doesn't even feel it's relevant to know whether God is corporeal or not, but he hasn't really given it much thought, but he totally believes in God. So that person is less connected to God, because not having any kind of mental certainty about that position on God makes you more distant from God. And finally, the least close to God is the one who believes that God is corporeal. Now again, the Rambam is not assigning any evil to these people, but the simple fact is that your devekut, your level of attachment or closeness to the Almighty, is based upon your intellectual prowess, plain and simple. And if a person has a mistaken conception about God, they cannot possibly be as close to God as the person who has an accurate portrayal of God intellectually. Point number 5. The more one tries to attribute positive attributes to God, the further away one comes from a true knowledge of Him. And here the Rambam gets somewhat technical, and here's where it becomes clear that he seems to be addressing some kind of disputant in his philosophical milieu. But I just want to read for you on page 139. I'll just read for you of just a couple of lines. It has accordingly first paragraph on page 139 in the Pines edition. It has accordingly become manifest to you that in every case in which the demonstration that a certain thing should be negated with reference to him becomes clear to you, you become more perfect, and that in every case in which you affirm of him an additional thing, you become one who likens him to other things, and you get further away from the knowledge of his true reality. And then the Rambam explains in particular why this is true. He says, in 5a, every possible positive attribute implies something which Pines translates as habitus. But in the Hebrew, there are two different ways of translating it from the Arabic. The traditional way of translating it is kinyan, and Kafich, Rav Yosef Kafich, the Yemenite rabbi of the 20th century who was responsible for so many new translations of Arabic texts into the Hebrew, translates it into the word tichuna. Kinyan is an acquisition of something that is innate within the thing that has acquired that trait, and tchuna means a quality, an internal quality within God. And this is impossible. This type of habitus, or what we'll call it a kinyan or tchuna, is impossible because, one, not all of these things are actually perfections. And this is using the interpretation of Rav Kreskes on the Moreh Nevukhim to explain. He points out that if we were to assign positive attributes to God, and we were to say that God has this, or God possesses this, then a possession, as we relate it to a human possession, is not always something positive. I may possess certain characteristic traits which are laudable, but I also may possess certain things which are not laudable. For example, I may have 5 cars, or I may have 2 houses. Those are things that are acquisitions, but are not necessarily a sign of a better person in any way other than the fact that I may have accumulated more wealth. So that's the first thing. To say that God possesses certain attributes is not necessarily in any way elevating God's status. And number 2, these things that we suggest that God has acquired, such as mercy, such as justice, and so forth, by definition come and go, and are sometimes mutually exclusive of each other. So therefore, anything that we can imagine God possessing in human terms would perforce lower God in our esteem, because we simply, in our human sphere, relate to a human being possessing certain things in ways that are completely inappropriate in the way that we address God. And then the Rambam writes that you further become distant from God in two respects when you think of God as having positive attributes, because number one, you are ascribing perfections which only for man are perfections, thus creating inappropriate similarities to corporeal man. Anytime a human being tries to make comparisons between God and man, the human being is necessarily lowering God in God's stature. This is of course, the tragic mistake that the ancient Greeks made, is that they fashioned the gods in their own image, and of course that led to all levels of malevolence within society when gods were ascribed with human traits. Then he says God does not possess any attribute other than his essence. So anytime, as we've said multiple times in previous chapters, anytime you assign attributes to God, you are negating God's unity. You are negating God, that God can only be defined by God, by the word God. He cannot be defined by any other term in any accurate way. And therefore, you are perforce lowering God's stature in your own mind anytime you try to describe God in any positive way. So that's point number 5. Now we go to point number 6. The concept of God being beyond our comprehension is something that is confirmed by both non-Jewish philosophers and by the prophets of Tanakh. And the Rambam doesn't give us an exact citation as a general rule whenever he is quoting from secular philosophy of his time. And it really becomes the responsibility of the scholars who research the Rambam's writings to try to trace down whom the Rambam was actually quoting. The Rambam just says that, as one philosopher has analogized, God's incomprehensibility, this philosopher said, is like trying to look at the sun directly, which is too bright for our feeble eyes to see clearly. And that's one, helpful metaphor to help us understand that, as no matter how hard we may try, we simply, just like the eye lacks the strength to be able to look directly at the sun without getting damaged, so too the human mind will never be able to gaze upon or truly apprehend God as he truly is. The Rav Kafich says that the Muslim philosopher of the 12th century, Al-Ghazali, was known for having said this in one of his works, but that seems to be whom the Rambam is quoting. And then the Rambam writes that this is also found in the Psalms. King David in the Psalm states, L'cha dumiyah tihila. In chapter 65 of the Psalms, King David says that to you, God, silence is praise. Now, the Rambam understands that silence is praise as the less you say positively about God, the more you are praising him. Again, perfect reference to a negative theology. We can only say what you are not, and that is the reason for our silence. And as he had quoted previously from Psalms chapter 4, Imru vilvavchem al mishkavchem v'domu sela, that speak to your hearts on your beds and be silent, sela, for perpetuity or eternally. And that too is a reference to the idea that a person should be silent when speaking about God, because you can contemplate. The Rambam had used this pasuk, this verse, to explain or to express how we can understand certain concepts in our mind even though we cannot articulate them verbally. But the Rambam is also using this verse to say that that's exactly what I mean by negative theology. We should not try to say anything positive about what God is, but rather can only contemplate about what God is not. Both of which imply that silence on describing God is better than saying anything else. And now for the rest of the chapter, the Rambam really devotes himself towards a very important passage that's found in the Talmud, the Gemara in Masechet Brachot, Daf Lamed Gimel Amid Bet, page 33b in Brachot, which also bears this point across that we are not permitted to assign any positive attributes to God. Not only is it inappropriate, but we're not even allowed to do so. And the Gemara's phraseology is as follows. And we'll read it in the original because it's a short passage. Hahu denachit kamei de Rabbi Chanina. There was once a man who was standing in front of Rabbi Chanina, and the way that the Talmud is implying it, he was acting as the shliach tzibor. He was acting as the leader of the prayer service. And in those days, there was a great level of illiteracy.
and the formal siddur had not yet been finalized. So it was permissible in Rabbi Chanina's period, he was an early rabbi in the at the cusp between the Tanaitic period and the Amoraitic period, but he was a student of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, and there was a man who was starting to open up his prayers to lead the prayer service, and he started to extemporaneously offer additional words of praise in the midst of his Shmona Esrei, in the midst of his prayer that we call the Amidah. So Amar Hakel Hagadol Hagibor VeHanora VeHaAdir VeHazuz VeHayarui HeChazak VeHamitz VeHavadai VeHanichbad, and he was using all different kinds of beautiful appellations for God. He called him the great, the mighty, the awesome, the strong, the rugged, the fearsome, the again, all different types of words for strong and mighty, the certain and the honored, etc., etc., etc. So himtin lo adisiyem. So Rabbi Chanina is standing there listening to this fellow, and he waits patiently for him until he's finished. Ki siyem amar le. Once he finished his words of praise of describing God, he said to him, Siyamtinhu lukulhu shvachei demarach. He said to him, have you now finished? Everything that can possibly be said about your Creator, you have finished. Lama likulehai, and his rhetorical question was, since there's no way for you to possibly give a full litany of what God's praises are, then why did you have to even say all that you did say? Anan hani tlat de amrinan ilav de amrinu Moshe Rabbeinu beoraita. He says the fact that when we start our Shmona Esrei, we say Hakel, Hagadol, Hagibor, Vahanora. We say that God is the great, the mighty, and the awesome. And those are three words that we use because we find that Moshe used them in the Torah. Va'atu anshe knesset hagdola v'takninhu batfilah. And the men of the great assembly further endorsed those words and allowed us to place them in our personal prayer. And that's the reason why Rabbi Chanina said that they are part of our formalized prayer, because by Rabbi Chanina's time, there was some level of formalization to prayer, and he basically was criticizing the Shliach Tzibor for taking license and extemporaneously adding words to the already fixed matbeah, the fixed format for that opening prayer of the Amidah. He said if Moshe had not said it in the Torah, and the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the men of the Great Assembly who lived in the early Second Temple period, had not formalized those words that Moshe recited in the Bible and placed them into our Siddur, into our prayer service, Lo Havinan Yecholin Lamemar Lo, we would not have been able to say those words. And as you'll see from the Rambam, we would not have been able to say them because they are positive attributions. But Ba'at Amart Kulei Hai Va'azalt, and now you have said even more than what they have given us license to say, and you've stopped. That's the greatest offense. Mashal lemelech basar vadam shahayulo elef alafim dinarei zahav. This can be compared to a king who had thousands upon thousands of gold coins. V'hayu mekalsino to b'shal kesef. And when it came time for the people to praise the king, they said, "Oh, you are the great and wealthy king who has so much silver." So v'halo genai hulo. This, of course, is an insult. Why are you praising the king for being the king of silver when in reality he is the king of gold? And that's the end of the quote from the Talmud Bavli from Tractate Brachot. And so the Rambam says what we learn from this dictum is two things. We may only use, and this is number 8 in our outline, we may only use the praises of God as they appear in Tanakh when we are citing passages of Tanakh. So the first thing is, if you're learning Tanakh as a Torah study project, then you are allowed to read whatever the verses contain in Tanakh because they were given to us by the prophets. Even though they contain positive attributes, as the Rambam will explain, they can be interpreted in certain ways. But we are only given license to use the words that they use. And now he says, when it comes to prayer, we may also use these passages in prayer, but only within the confines of what the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the men of the Great Assembly, this body of rabbis who lived during the first part of the Second Temple period, set down for us when they formalize the text of the prayer service. That is, we may not innovate additional prayers even if using praises of God that appear in Tanakh. So, for example, in this story, in Tractate Brachot, the man that was acting as the Shliach Tzibur was using actual Hebrew words that do appear in Tanakh, but not in the context or not within the strictures of what the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah permitted us to use in prayer. So you need to have both criteria. Number one, for prayer, they need to be both words that appear in Tanakh as descriptions of God, and number two, they have to have been sanctioned by the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, who also were themselves prophets, and therefore, because they were endowed with prophetic knowledge, they knew exactly which words we would be allowed to say, and which words we are not allowed to say. And we're now in the text on the bottom of page 140 and the top of page 141. Now here I should really point out that the Rambam is not negating the potential for extemporaneous prayer. As a matter of fact, in Hilchot Tfilah, the laws of prayer in the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam is a big proponent of a human being using his own words to pray to God. The only objection, however, that he's putting down over here in the Moreh Nevukhim is that when you are describing God himself, you are very severely limited, both by the biblical text and furthermore by what the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah allow you to extract from that biblical text and place in your prayers. But when you want to describe the way that you would like to relate to God, this unknowable God, and what your petitions are, and how much you love God, and describing your affection for God, that you are allowed to, and it's actually laudable for you to try and use your own words in expressing those ideas. Now, one may feel that there's a fine line there. I'm not sure if it's such a fine line. It seems to be a very clear line of demarcation. The Rambam simply is basically saying how you describe God is off limits. When you want to describe God in your prayers, you must conform to a very, very limited set of vocabulary that was set down by the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. Other ways that you want to use, other words that you want to put in your prayer to describe your own feelings, to describe your needs, to describe the type of relationship that you would like to have with this unknowable God, that's all fair game and actually is laudable for a person at the appropriate places in his prayer to use his own verbiage, his own vocabulary. And this is where we get towards the end of the chapter, where the Rambam is now critical of the unnamed contemporaries within the Jewish community who sermonize and write poetry in praise of God using the positive attributes contained in Tanakh, but using them without the license that was granted by the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, and thus distorting the apprehension of God only further. So 9a is, they even intimated, forgive the typo, they even intimated that God is subject to influence by us in their poetry, suggesting that God wakes up at some times when we cry out to him, and that he may be sleeping at other times. This is really quite offensive, says the Rambam, that to suggest that God is somehow triggered by us in some way and that God is subject to change. B, some of this poetry is absolute heresy. It would be laughable in its absurdity were it not referring to God, which thus makes it worthy of crying over, because it truly does exploit God in a way that is truly insulting and is hurtful. The Rambam says, quite frankly, if we were talking about anything else, we would laugh at the absurdity of how people get their descriptions so off base. But now that we're talking about God, it actually hurts. It hurts, and it's worth crying over that these well-intentioned people are leading us so far astray. And the Rambam then says, I'm actually tempted to quote some of this poetry to cite examples of how far off they are, but the wise person will be able to detect their flaw immediately upon inspection. And so we really don't even know which poetry and which kinds of sermons and prose the Rambam was referring to. 9d, this poetry also constitutes the greatest form of Lashon Hara and Motzi Shemra, which is slander and outright, lying about God, misrepresenting God in a very, very negative way, because you're actually diminishing God's stature and saying things that actually make him look bad, because it is against God. And if Lashon Hara, if speaking ill of others, is forbidden by the Torah, can you imagine how bad it is to speak ill of God himself? And although these people are not doing it maliciously, malevolently, nonetheless, it is a terrible thing. These people are not intentionally shaming and profaning God because their intentions are noble, but they are nonetheless sinning with the term in Hebrew which would be chiruf v'giduf, which is shaming God, in other words, using shameful appellations for God, and actually cursing God in a way, even though they intend to do the opposite. They intend to exalt God, but they are cursing him in the process. No one therefore should learn from these sermonizers, but those who do are truly in error innocently, and they are just basically wandering in the dark. And the Rambam cites a pasuk from the book of Kings to 2 Kings chapter 17. The Rambam says, and the children of Israel did impute things that were not right unto the Lord their God. And that's what people are doing when they read this kind of poetry. We all know the stories in the Talmud of those who are metiach dvarim klape mala. And what the Rambam is referring to was there was a great sage by the name of Levi. He was one of the key disciples of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Yehuda the prince, the president of the Jewish people. And the story that the Rambam is making reference to, perhaps others as well, is that Levi spoke inappropriately in his petitions to God on behalf of the Jewish community, and he was punished for that. The Talmud in Tractate Ta'anit, page 25a, says, Levi gazer ta'aneta v'lo ati mitra, that Levi decreed that a fast in the times of drought, and still rain did not fall. And he therefore turned up his head in prayer to God, but in a provocative way. Amar lefanav ribono shel olam, alita v'yashavta b'marom. He said to God, perhaps you've ascended so high unto the heavens, ve'ein ata merachem al banecha, that you no longer have the capacity to have mercy on your children because you are so far removed from us. Now that's them's fighting words, as they say. This is very provocative. And Levi actually did this in order to show his state of desperation. And, if Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev of the Hasidic time did that, he would be praised as a tzaddik. But the Gemara says there are certain kinds of words that are offensive even when your intentions are good. And ata mitra be'itla. And the Gemara then says that finally, because Levi was so provocative and so provocational towards God, God finally relented and allowed it to rain. But then Levi, as a result, was punished and he became a cripple. He became disabled as a result and could never walk properly after that. So Amar Rabbi Elazar says, La'olam al yatiach adam dvarim klape maila, that we learn from this story that a person should not be metiach dvarim, which really says to utter error against the Lord, really is the way that Pines translates it, or make vituperative utterances against what is above. Basically, don't be provocational in the way that you speak about God, even if your intentions are good. Shaharei Adam Gadol hitich dvarim klape maila ve'itla umano Levi. Because you see what happened to Levi. He spoke vituperatively, he spoke provocationally against God, and you see what happened to him. And this again is an example, says the Rambam, of how we have to be very careful in our selection of speech, because we may be very well intentioned, but look at the damage that we are doing in the way that we describe Hashem. Not only can it affect the way we think of God and make us more distant from the Almighty, but it could actually have a negative effect on others as well if they learn from us. We'll just finish off with, as we have already stated, any positive attributes which appear in Tanakh are either metaphor, as we pointed out, or they are actional attributes or negate their non-existence within God, and that's what I had mentioned at the very outset when we first started this chapter. And then the Rambam finishes off by saying, I just want to go back to the Rabbi Chanina story a little bit further. Note that in the parable that Rabbi Chanina gave to this Shliach Tzibor, this fellow who was leading the davening, he did not say that praising God excessively is similar to those who praise the king for having 100 pieces of gold when he really has 1,000,000 pieces of gold. But rather, he said, it's like praising a king who possesses gold by saying that he possesses silver. And the Rambam says there's a very sort of subtle message there, but it's a very important message, that this shows that God is not only a quantitative difference
in the way that we praise God. It's not that we simply lack the knowledge, the language to adequately say what God is. Like we say in the Nishmat Kol Chai prayer, Ilu Finu Malay Shira Kayam, if our mouths could fill themselves up with song, perhaps you might think that we could properly praise you, God, and we simply lack the number of words. It's beyond that. It's that God is a sui generis, completely different category, completely different species, says the Rambam. It's not even that we only have 100 pieces of gold and the king has 1,000,000 pieces of gold. The king has gold and all we have to talk about him is silver. And therefore we don't have our language. Even if we could expand our language ad infinitum, we still would not be able to properly describe God in any positive way. And therefore Rambam concludes this chapter with King Solomon's words in Kohelet chapter 5, Ecclesiastes, to confirm the need for a negative theology. And we'll just conclude with this verse as the Rambam does. Al tivahel al picha. Do not confuse your mouth. V'libecha al yemaher lahotzi davar lifnei ha'elokim. And let not your heart be quick to produce words in the God's presence. Just, in the way that Levi did mistakenly. Ki ha'elokim b'shamayim ve'ata al haaretz. Because God, after all, is in the heavens, and you are on the earth. Two different planes of existence, and therefore, because we don't really relate to God properly, al kain yihiyu devarecha me'atim. Therefore, let your words be very few. Again, the same idea. The negative theology of God demands of us that we not describe God in any positive way. So I think this was a better use of our time than perhaps last week, when the Rambam got very, very technical into some certain philosophical ideas. But this chapter was much more straightforward. It analyzes a piece of Gemara from the Masechet Brachot, which really brings home this idea that no matter how much we may try to positively ascertain in our minds what God is, we will always fall flat. There are ways, of course, of gaining a greater, truer sense of understanding of Hashem, but only by narrowing down further what we know that God is not. And the more that we can do that, and as we're going to go further down this hole to sort of expand on this further in the ensuing chapters until we get to the end of the first section, we will see that the Rambam is going to further polemicize against many of his contemporaries who disagreed on this basic point and felt that it is possible to find something positive to say about God. And the Rambam is insistent in this chapter, as he has been in all the previous chapters, that no, it simply is not. And this is where we'll hold it today for our chapter. We've gone a little bit over time, and want to thank you just for participating, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Take care now, everybody.